You don't need a degree in economics or physics to know that you can't make something out of nothing. Land is the requisite to human existence. It is on the land that we live, and from it we produce our food, clothing, and shelter. To say that some people have a greater right to land because they have inherited or bought it is just as clearly to say they have a greater right to life because they have inherited or purchased land. Through the machinations of land speculators, it is not only our universities, but our legislators that have exorcised the bounty of nature from the science of political economy. Our laws make no distinction between the gifts of nature and the buildings and machinery that are produced by labor to give it a greater efficiency. It is all categorized as capital and called property, as though it were produced by the first people who assigned it. I don't say that our government is totally corrupt. Every elected official isn't siphoning funds for himself and his family. But the foundation of our economic system has been corrupted by the notion that land is property. Yes, we've made private property out of the natural opportunities, and we have caused a shortage of jobs, driven wages to a minimum, made the cost of housing exorbitant, eliminated the return on savings, and caused depressions and recessions. And we've created personal fortunes larger than most of us can even imagine. While our scholars and politicians have covertly combined land with the products of labor, it is not by their ownership of buildings and machines that the 1% and the 0.1% of our population are able to capture the lion's share of what the vast majority are able to produce. The 1% and the 0.1% may very well own the majority of factories and machines in this country, but their power to take what other people produce, to amass gigantic fortunes, comes from their ownership of land. Whether it is the 2 billion acres of agricultural land, the mineral lands with oil and gas, the ground under the central business districts, the airwaves used by TV and cell phones, or the right-of-ways used to deliver utilities to every house in the country, or even all the land under the rental housing, it is the title to the gifts of nature that gives them the power to take what other people produce and to become the sole beneficiaries of material progress. To be sure, it is not only, land is not the only government-granted monopoly that gives a license to steal. Perhaps the banks and the drug companies are getting over $1 trillion a year. But it is obvious if we could end their larceny, the owners of land would inherit the spoils. I'm reminded that this is the 400th anniversary of the first black slaves in the Virginia colony. By 1860, slaves made up the vast majority of what was considered capital in the southern states. Britain had abolished slavery at home more than 30 years before the United States. But by 1830, wages of the English agricultural workers were not much more than the food, clothing, and shelter paid to American slaves. In 1860, the United States had by far the highest wages in the world. It is no wonder that the slaves were so valuable, or that their owners were willing to go to war over the possible loss of their assets. Remember, the United States acquired 1 million square miles with the conquest of Mexico in 1848, and it would be another 25 years after the Civil War and after the Oklahoma land rush before the free land was gone and wages began that long, slow slide tending toward the minimum of food, clothing, and shelter paid to slaves. It may have taken a decade or so, but once the southern plantation owners got back their land and the federal troops were gone, they employed the Ku Klux Klan terrorists, who transformed the landless freemen into serfs and were wage slaves. They paid them little more than food, clothing, and shelter, and after that, no one had a vested interest in keeping them healthy. Well, here we are, 150 years after the Civil War and the end of chattel slavery. Wages of the least skilled and educated workers, white, black, red, and yellow, tend to an amount below which they would get weak and produce less wealth. The wages of superior workers, no matter how much they produce, tend to an amount below which they would lose the incentive to acquire the skills and knowledge. We've intervened with a legal minimum wage, the 8-hour day, OSHA, unemployment insurance, workman's compensation, Social Security, and Medicare. That is a whole lot better than the Alabama Slave Code of 1852. It mandated that the owner provide their slaves of working age with sufficiency of healthy food, clothing, attention during illness, and necessities in old age. Nonetheless, one person produces and another person consumes, and that is the motive and the essence of slavery. Today, of course, we are all nominally free, but every landless person is dependent directly or indirectly upon a landowner for a job and a place to live. You can choose your landlord if they agree, but the landless are nonetheless wage slaves, and no particular landowner has any monetary interest in your health and well-being. Well, I turned on the TV last night and there's still more than a dozen candidates competing for the party's nomination for the presidency. Every one of them is talking about legislation to enhance the lives of the American worker, especially the middle class, which includes everyone who's earning more than the minimum wage and everyone who's not yet a multimillionaire. Universal health care may be at the top of the list, and while it would certainly be a godsend to the workers, it will also be the cheapest way to keep the labor pool in good working condition. A better educated workforce is the first thing that landowners must have if they are going to compete with the rest of the world. Raising the minimum wage would certainly enhance the lives and happiness of our wage slaves. It is probably the best way to prevent the return of conditions that plagued American cities at the turn of the 20th century, when pneumonia and tuberculosis pervaded the population and ruined families and grossly reduced the production of wealth. Keep in mind, for the minimum wage to benefit workers, they must have access to housing that doesn't take in rent what they gained in wages. An increase in the minimum wage might very well pay for itself with a higher degree of public health and social harmony. But it doesn't diminish land speculation, so it can't create jobs, which is the systematic way that wages rise. With nearly 1 million green card immigrants coming into the country every year, these already skilled and educated workers increase the supply and reduce the wages of superior workers. What is good for the landlords is good for the economy, is good for the country. Native-born workers, there just aren't enough of you with the right skills and education to fill the jobs. The fact that 1.6% of the 12 million illegal immigrant workers were deported each year before the recession tells me what is good for the landlords is good for the economy, is good for the country. But of course, we could stop land speculation, and if we choose to, we could assimilate the entire population of Mexico, and then Britain would still be 3.5 times more densely populated than the United States. The first and most important step in breaking the chains of slavery is owning a house and the land underneath it. Once you get that fixed rate, 30-year mortgage, no one can ever raise your rent again, no matter how much the land increases in value. And every percent of inflation reduces the interest and the principal owed on your mortgage. Why else would we go to such extremes to qualify for a mortgage and buy an overpriced house? Home ownership is the reason there aren't a whole lot more Americans living in poverty. But the recession pushed 5% of our homeowners back into renters. We can tax the rich, or we can go on taxing production. But either way, it comes out of what would otherwise go to the landowners in rent. Wages and welfare can only go so low before the resulting crime and disorder create the social conditions that diminish rents and drag us down to a second a third world despotism. Put 100 people on an island from which there is no escape. And whether you make the one the owner of the island or the other 99 makes no difference to him or to them. They are his slaves. While the single tax is the only system of freedom I know with equal opportunity and universal prosperity, I have no expectation of its success within my own lifetime or that of anyone I know. But slavery is wrong. Whether it is chattel slavery or wage slavery, whether the slaves get both Saturday and Sunday off, whether it provides meritorious wages that allow some people to buy land and with it their freedom, slavery is wrong, and I stand against it here and now. Madam Chairman?